sorry about that. Welcome to GPS, everyone, this morning. A quick reminder to keep yourself muted, to keep down the background noise until the question and answer period at the end. You can also put questions in the chat, and we'll either get to those at the end or work them in at a time that makes sense. So it is my pleasure this morning to introduce Bob Arbogast, who is the stated clerk of Classis East, and he's also pastor at Celebration Fellowship. You may have heard Bob and I chatting for just a minute before things started. Bob's not allowed in the prisons right now with COVID and everything, so that's a situation that's waiting to develop. But instead of asking Bob to give a formal presentation this morning, what we've decided is to frame this more as an informal conversation, so we can ask him questions about classes, about Synod, about overtures, nuts and boltsy kind of things, bigger things. So I'll start by asking Bob some questions, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. We thought it was important for all of us in general to know more about Classis and how it works and what it does. But today we have a special emphasis on how that fits with COS's engagement with Human Sexuality Report in our listening circles. So we're hoping this conversation is going to help the listening circles. It's going to help the facilitators, and it's maybe going to be of some use to council. So in the announcement, I believe it was the one that came out this morning, there are links to the other overtures that were filed with Classis East this year. So if anyone is curious and wants to look those up and read those, they will now be on, I believe, the GPS page for COS. So we'll spend some time, about 10 minutes each, talking about a couple topics, Classis and overtures, Synod, and opportunities to work with Classis. So hi, Bob, and welcome. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about yourself other than what I've said.
I think that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see some interesting guitars in your background, but we'll save that for the question and answer period at the delve into that part of things. So first, we're going to talk about overtures at the Classis level. Some of the folks who are listening here have been part of the CRC for a long time, and so some of the stuff we're going to talk about is old hat. Others of us could use a refresher, or maybe we've never looked at some of this stuff before. So we'll ask for the patience of those who know this stuff really, really well, and we'll try and just lay a short foundation for some of the questions that we're going to get into later on. So to start with, foundation number one, which is the CRC. It has three levels of government, so to speak. There's the councils and the individual churches, which is the deacons, the elders, and the pastors. Next is the Classis, and next is the Synod. And so, Bob, my first question to you is, what's a Classis and what does it do?
A Classis is traditionally a regional group of churches. And a Classis basically is a gathering of representatives from those churches that get together to do things that concern the churches together, as opposed to individual or local matters. And the Classis also will deal with some things that concern, in a way, the denomination as a whole. To give you one example, when a church is calling a minister, and let's say they're actually calling a candidate for ministry who has not yet been ordained, the Classis gets involved in that, in examining this minister candidate, but it doesn't do it alone. The Classis does it in conjunction with representatives from other classes that represent the denomination as a whole. Ministers aren't just ordained locally. They're ordained in a process that concerns the whole church, the whole denomination. And so Classis is one of the ways that churches come together to do things together.
Okay. How many churches are there in Classis East right now?
Oh, I knew I was supposed to look that up. I think it's about 18.
Yeah, 18 or 19, I think is.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay, and Classis East is the Classis that COS belongs to. So another broad brush foundation question, what is an overture?
An overture is a communication to one of the governing bodies of the church, to a classis or to a synod, that asks that body to take some kind of action, to do this, to do that, to not do this, to not do that. It's simply put, that's all it is.
Okay. So this year, when we're, and in this particular discussion, we're really focused on overtures that have to do with the Human Sexuality Report. How many did Classis East get this year for the Human Sexuality Report?
This year there are, it's 3 or 4. How come I don't remember? We have one from COS, one from Calvin, one from Neeland Avenue, and I think that's all. I think it's those 3.
Okay, no,
Yeah.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's where I turn it over to you to run a little bit. What happens to them at Classis? Does Classis looks at them and go, oh, good one. Oh, that one, bad one. Yes, no. What is that process like?
The main thing about a classis, and this is true of a synod as well, they are designed to be, the term is deliberative assemblies. In other words, we gather together and we deliberate, we think, we question, we answer, we wonder, we pray. All of it's supposed to be prayerfully done. And so when we have an overture, for example, this gets in the weeds a little bit, but the overture from COS, for example, is only asking classes to send an overture to synod. Okay, and the content of the overture that COS wants classes to send to synod is there in the overture from COS. And so what classes will do when we gather in a special meeting on March 3 is we will take up the overture from COS, and there will be a recommendation that classes adopt the overture and send it to synod, and then we'll talk about it. And we'll ask questions, and we will maybe argue with one another, maybe encourage one another, but we'll have a conversation about it, and we'll pray about it, and then we'll vote and make a decision about whether to send the overture to synod or not. And the same thing will happen with the other overtures that are on the agenda.
Okay, so there's no committee or group of executives, people at the executive level at Classis who do some pre-sorting and find the ones that they think are more worthy or less worthy. That's not the role?
No, neither at Classis nor at synod is there anyone who decides whether an overture is worthy or not. If an overture is submitted, it is on the agenda. It is before the assembly. At synod, there are advisory committees, and they will look at the overture ahead of time, or look at it before the synod as a whole considers it, and they will go through that same kind of deliberative process. They will ask questions. They often will have the people who wrote the overture there so they can find out, more details that might be relevant. And they might have people that they will meet and talk with who are, let's say, area experts who maybe know the biblical materials really well or whatever it may be. And then that committee will make a recommendation to synod to adopt the overture, to modify the overture, or what have you. And synod might choose to listen to that committee, or it might choose not to. And the synod can do whatever it wants. At Classis, we don't tend to have advisory committees like that. It tends to be that just the classis as a whole will look at and talk about and decide about the overture.
Okay, so of the churches who are gathering at this meeting you mentioned in March, if a church who's a member of Classis doesn't agree, then they vote against it. It's a majority vote for whether or not that overture goes ahead and is passed on to Synod.
Yes.
Okay. So Synod meets every year. Last year canceled due to COVID. What happened to any overtures about the Human Sexuality Report that were submitted last year? Are those still in play?
Yes, all those overtures will be in front of Synod this year.
Okay. When is Classis East? Oh no, you answered this question already. They're going to be talking about this at the meeting on March 3, right?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Originally, that meeting was scheduled for January. And why was that moved to March?
We still had a meeting in January, but because of the Omicron spike, we thought it would be best that we not meet in person. And we thought that discussion of the overtures would be best done in person as opposed to over Zoom. So we thought if we delayed the meeting by about 5 weeks or 6 weeks, whatever it is, that we were hoping that the Omicron wave would have subsided enough so that we can do it in person.
Okay. Can anyone go to this March 3 meeting and hear people talk about these overtures?
Yes. Yeah, this is a thing that people don't often realize. Synodical meetings are public meetings. Classis meetings are public meetings. And the meetings of your church council are public meetings. Anyone can go. There are certain segments in a meeting where they might have to say, okay, we're going to be in executive session, so only the delegates or the office bearers can be present for this part of the meeting. That would be especially the case if they were talking about something relative to an individual person, a minister candidate, and you're deciding whether to admit her to the ministry or not. That happens in executive session.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about these deadlines. COS submitted an overture, and we were under the impression that this deadline was November 30. And this is something I've asked you about before, Bob, but we're just explaining a little bit more. But the deadline for overtures to Synod is March 15. Now, why is there a difference between November 30 and March 15?
Yeah, well, before COS cannot submit an overture directly to Synod, it first has to submit the overture to Classis. Classis schedules its winter meeting the third Thursday, I think it is, of January. And in order for the delegates to the meeting to have sufficient time to read and reflect and consider the overtures or anything that's on the agenda is distributed about a month ahead of the meeting. And in order for that to happen, the stated clerk, that's me, needs to have all the relevant materials ahead of that time so that I can put the agenda together. And so that's where that November 30 deadline came from.
Okay.
Also, if you don't have a deadline, then people will keep trying to submit stuff up to the last minute. And it's not the best procedure that way because especially with significant items, the delegates need to be able to see it ahead of time and read, because it's a lot to read and ponder.
Okay, and you anticipated my next question. Right now at COS, we're in the middle of listening circles. Some of these circles are going to finish after March. There's going to be a procedure where some of the observations that people feel comfortable passing on to council are passed on to council. If at that point COS says, you know, we've heard what people have said, there's some more overtures we'd like to submit. If it's after March 15, that's too late then, right?
After March 15, it's still possible for overtures to be submitted to Synod, I believe, but I think also they have to be overtures related to material that is in the published agenda that wasn't previously available. So I don't think you could send in an overture directly about the Human Sexuality Report because that's been available for some time. And the deadline was March 15. But when the printed agenda comes out, there may be an overture from Classis Overshoe. And COS may read that overture and it may stir up some strong reactions from COS, and COS may want to submit an overture that Synod not adopt an overture from Classis Overshoe, and for these reasons. So that kind of overture could be submitted after the March deadline.
Okay, almost more of a reactive thing, like now we've seen theirs and we have this to say about it.
Right, right.
Gotcha. Okay. So here at COS, we're thinking about the Human Sexuality Report. We've submitted our overture for Synod. So now I'm going to direct some of our questions to what happens at Synod. And same thing, asking the patience of people who know this answer really well. What is Synod?
Synod used to be this wonderful gathering. I say used to be, it seems like it's changed. Essentially, the Synod is the assembly that looks after matters that concern all the churches in the denomination, or matters that are too large for the individual churches to take care of, or the classes to take care of themselves, like sponsoring a mission agency and so on. The Synod gathers once a year, typically in June, and it spends a number of days initially in committee meetings, and that's with a whole set of advisory committees that focus on a particular part of the agenda and then provide recommendations to Synod as a whole about how to deal with those items on the agenda. And then you have the plenary sessions, I think that's what they're called, when all the delegates are present. And then we hear from those committees and we hear their recommendations, and we either vote in favor or vote against, or develop new recommendations, or tell them go back and do more work, and so on. And somewhere in that process, any overtures from Classis East will be considered. Now, but here's the thing. With the Human Sexuality Report has its own recommendations for Synod. And those recommendations will be on the agenda. They will be on the floor of Synod. And the advisory committee that's going to say to Synod, here's what we think ought to happen with the Human Sexuality Report. Part of the background for their recommendations will be any overtures from Classis East, any overtures from any of the classes. They will probably have about 50 or 100 overtures that will be part of their background reading and reflection on the issue of the Human Sexuality Report. And that'll all be in the mix as they frame their recommendations to Synod. And then Synod will vote yes or no on those recommendations. And one of the recommendations near the end of the list will be that Synod declare that these actions just taken will be Synod's response to Overture 33 from Classis Grand Rapids East, Overture 29 from Classis Lake Erie, and so on. So the individual overtures are not considered by Synod on a piecemeal basis. They are information, and they inform the work of the advisory committee, especially. Now, all the delegates have the overtures and can read and reflect on them for it to shape how they vote on the recommendations. Anyway, I hope that's clear.
It's a complicated process, and if people want to follow up with some questions, that's what the chat box and the questions at the end are
Sure.
for. Like you said, we're going to have to come at this a variety of different ways to, I think, get at everybody's different concerns or interests. So the individual churches aren't there to vote. Like COS have their 3 or 4 people that vote at Synod, so to speak. All that voting is done through the Classis delegates. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so we don't think of, oh, we're sending our COS people.
No, and the other thing to be aware of is that a classis sends delegates, and the classis cannot tell the delegates how to vote. The classis cannot say, you must vote no on this, or you must vote yes on this. The delegates are free to deliberate and vote according to the process, what the process leads them to.
Okay. So how many classes are there roughly in Synod?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Have that at your fingertips.
Yeah, I don't know, 40 or something.
49, does that sound?
That could be right, yeah. So
Okay.
it's a big group with 4 delegates from each.
Okay, so roughly 49 classes, 4 delegates from each, which would be 1 minister, excuse me, 1 elder, 1 deacon, and I think it's one at-large person. So 49 times 4, that's 196 votes, right?
Yeah.
So when they're voting on this, simple majority wins?
Yes. Yes. I don't know if I'd use the word wins, but
prevail or
yeah.
motion carries. Yeah, I'll be careful with how I phrase. I didn't mean to imply or not imply anything with that. Excuse me, if the Human Sexuality Report, if Synod passes that this year with all its included recommendations, does that become final, or does a subsequent Synod have to do something to make it achieve final status?
Subsequent synods only have to approve things that would require a change in the church order. And I don't know that anything in the report is recommending a change in the church order. I'm not sure about that. They are talking about wanting their point of view to have on certain aspects to have confessional status. And I don't know if you, I mean, the church order says something about what our confessions are, and but it doesn't include any notions of here's a binding interpretation of those confessions. So maybe that would be something that would require ratification of a subsequent synod, but I'm just speculating.
Okay, that's a question that's up for grabs right now, and more discussion and more reflection would have to.
Yeah, as far as I know.
Okay.
I could be wrong too.
Okay, well.
Not for the first time.
We're all human. This is a process, so this we're finding out as we go, which is one of the reasons why we're talking to you today. So, can any delegate speak at Synod? And how long, if they can, how long are they allowed to speak for?
Yes, any delegate may speak. On some matters, the chair or the executive team may decide to limit the length of speeches. They may also limit the number of times an individual delegate may speak. Something that also happens on an issue that gets really complex and there's lots of discussion, you could have a good number of speakers in the queue waiting for their opportunity to speak, and then somebody in that queue might call for the question. And that means that no new speakers can be added to the queue. And one of the problems with that is that some of the remaining speakers may bring up some new issue that needs a response, and you want to respond to it, but you can't because they've closed the queue. That's not as fraught a situation at a Classis because we don't have a long queue of speakers. But there are times at Synod when you don't get to speak.
Okay, I'll ask this question carefully because I don't want to imply anything one way or the other, but are there maneuvers that people can use to shut down discussion on sensitive issues? And if so, is there a way to stop that from happening?
There are maneuvers, and those maneuvers have been happening more frequently, is my understanding. I know they were going on in I think it was 2016, might have been the synod I was there before that. I forget what year that was. The synod has made statements now that delegates may not be in communication with outside people while they're on the floor of synod, because you could have people in, pick a place in Seattle, Washington, watching synod live on their computers, and they could be sending text messages, strategizing, and offering, advice about, oh, you might want to say this, or you might want to say that, or here's a plan and here's a strategy. It appears that there have been some maneuvers in terms of when to call for the question, because that can shut things down, or to have even a motion to cease debate. And I think that maybe cuts off the queue, though I'm not sure about that. But yes, and what can be done about it? The synodical committee has said, don't do that. But I fear that our synodical assemblies and a lot of things going on in the church are starting to mirror the shenanigans of the Republican and Democratic parties in the way that they behave towards each other. And I find it really distressing.
Okay. And by that you mean more polarized approach?
Yeah,
to
polarized. A focus on winning as being basically all that matters, and do it whatever way you can, because it's so important that that you don't have to abide by common decency, let's say, in how you conduct business.
Okay. I'm going to ask, I'll just take a slight detour here, but relevant to the idea of synod, because I think it's a subject that's come up sometimes in some of the listening circles. You were on a committee that made a recommendation to synod about what the makeup of the committee would be that prepared the Human Sexuality Report. And I was wondering if you could share with us, what was your recommendation and what happened to that recommendation?
Our recommendation was to put together a really broad and representative or diverse committee. We wanted there to be young people on the committee. I don't have any records of this, but I do recall that we were thinking about, yeah, just a broad selection of people to be on this committee without any set of pre-commitments on the issues. But that basically was just swiped away, and a new direction was put into play. And the key element of that new direction in putting the committee together was that everyone who served on the committee had to affirm the 1973 report on homosexuality. And if you didn't affirm those conclusions, then you couldn't be on the committee, which is interesting.
Okay, and that's exactly not what your committee had recommended.
Not at all, no.
Okay. Bob, I'm sure you get this question, and you and I talked about this before, so you know it's coming. Do you have any predictions about whether Synod is going to go ahead and approve the Human Sexuality Report this year?
I really don't know. I don't know enough about where, I mean, Classis Grand Rapids East is an outlier, okay? Classis Lake Erie, where I came from a few years ago, used to be one of those partner outlying classes with Grand Rapids East. Lake Erie isn't that way anymore, but Grand Rapids East still is. There are, it seems to me, probably outlier classes on the opposite end of a spectrum. But what I don't know is, where is the vast middle? I really don't know. Well, I think a synod would be likely to endorse the human sexuality report in some general sense, but I think there are problematic things. That confessional status issue, I think, is one of them. And there are also real issues with the tone of the report, the attitude of the report. It's not a gentle and generous kind of report. So even people who agree with some of the content may have a hard time adopting various recommendations. So I don't know. I really don't, but I think there's going to be fallout no matter what.
Okay. That was one of my questions. No matter what synod decides, your sense of things is there are going to be churches who leave.
I think so. I think so.
Bob, I'm going to turn next to, we've had some questions in some of the circles. And for those who aren't in the circles, bear with us. But I'll try and explain those. One of the questions we ask in the listening circles are, what are some next steps that COS could take or the church could take? And some people have wondered, well, does that mean we just have to sit and wait for Synod to decide something and then we're going to react to it? What does this mean? And so some of the questions I'm going to ask are maybe to get a little bit more of a background for that or explore some of those ideas. So I'll start by asking this. Does Classis East have a plan for how to respond to whatever Synod decides about the Human Sexuality Report?
No, not at this point.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that churches can write overtures, and those overtures can be to Classis East, and they can be to Synod. You can direct an overture that's just to Classis East, for example.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you, just for the sake of conversation, and I'm not trying to promote one overture or another, one viewpoint or another, just for the sake of us exploring this in our conversation. If in the course of these listening circles, people looked at the issue of pornography and they said, wow, we read that report. We had no idea this was such an extensive problem. Our eyes are open. This is something we want to do something about. This seems like something a little bit bigger than just our one little church can do. So would a potential idea, for example, be for a council of a church to say, Classis East, are there some resources or some ideas you could help us as we grapple with this as a community? Would that be the kind of thing that could be made the subject of an overture to Classis East?
Something near that could be perhaps just simply asking if there are resources. That's just a question. Right. But if COS were to submit an overture to Classis that would say, please put together a group of people who can assemble resources on this issue that will be useful to the churches, then that'd be something for the Classis to say, yeah, that's a great idea, let's do that, or to say, nah, we don't want to do that. So again, the overture asked for some kind of action.
Okay. And as part of that, and I'm going to take a step back, in 2016, Classis East prepared a report that presented some biblical support in support of same-sex marriage and same-sex attraction. Some people are aware of that body of research. Some people are not. If, as part of considering this whole issue, regardless of where you fall on in your support or agreement with the Human Sexuality Report, you wanted to know more about that report that Classis East drafted, you want to dig into that a little bit more, could that also be the subject of an overture? A church would say, we would like Classis East to put together a discussion panel or a discernment process where we dig into this report as part of our global consideration. Would that be the kind of thing that Classis East could tackle? Okay.
Yes. There have been some events connected with that report, though that was some years ago. I know there was a public event not too long after I got here to Classis East. So that would have been maybe in 2018, which seems so long ago now.
Long, it's in COVID years, which are like 5 times longer than regular years or something along those lines. So I also read, and I'll not take up much time with this, there was a report written a few years ago called Better Together, and it was about handling stressful situations in the classes. It wasn't directed at this per se, but there was a very interesting observation in there that I wanted to put out in front of us, which is it's very frustrating and it seems like it's very slow moving at times to get something done in the CRC. And this report basically said it's designed that way for a reason. We as a denomination have decided we don't want to one deliberative body to be a slow, messy, but the downside is it can take a long time to resolve an issue. It can take a long time and things can go back and forth. People don't know exactly who's that one person who can get things going, and that's all by design. Is that something that Classis East has talked much about? That's sort of that built-in inertia.
Not in my time, but I do have some thoughts about that. There is a certain amount of systemic inertia, and on purpose, but there are other things that slow the process down. At a synod back in, I don't know, 2011, 2012, whenever it was, there was a recommendation that synod would do a new study in connection with the question of human sexuality. That was years before the actual committee was appointed. And you just had this movement on the floor of synod that was just saying, no, 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 we're not going to do that because that will be nothing but trouble. And so we voted not to do it. And as soon as that vote was taken, I saw one of the youth representatives there at synod. He just got up and he walked out of the room, shaking his head. And I followed him, because he seemed like he was really distressed. And so I talked with him a bit, and his concern is the church being paralyzed by fear, the church being afraid to think new thoughts, to go where the Spirit may lead out of a sense of fear. And I think that also is partly why things go slow, because we're afraid of where things might go if we don't slam on the brakes, if we don't drag our feet.
Okay. Bob, I'm taking a look at our time, and I have to emphasize to you, you are not required to stay a minute past 12:30 if you don't want dinner to burn in the oven or you got somewhere to go. So with that in mind, I'm going to open it up and see if anybody has some questions they want to float by Bob. We've covered a lot of material, a lot of stuff there aren't clean answers for, but Bob's a knowledgeable source, and I want to give people a chance to ask those questions if they would like. So let's open it up. Bob, you've obviously done such a swell job of explaining this stuff.
Not another minute with this guy, please.
Release us. But you've been really helpful and really agreeable when we've emailed questions over. So if anyone in COS has a question, either funneled through council, through the task force, through other folks, you're agreeable to answering those questions about church procedure and
oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that is good to hear, Bob. I thank you so much for your time. I always enjoy talking to you. I'll take, because I've got 4 minutes left, I have to ask you about the fun guitars on the wall. Are you in a band or?
Yes, I am. I play in the Tomasa Esparza Blues Band.
I have Do you have records out?
No, we don't. No, we don't have any records out. We just play in various places around West Michigan. I stumbled into that. It just sort of happened a few years ago. COVID has made a mess out of it, but we're doing some gigging again now. So
Well, good to hear. It sounds like a nice diversion from some of the other stuff you do, right?
yeah, it is. Yeah.
Take care. So I'm going to take one last look and see if there's, I'm not seeing anything typed in the chat box. People are always welcome to email the questions later, and we can route those to Bob and get answers for those kind of things. So if you looking, thank you so much for information on the Synod complementarian in support of the penal substitution theology. Okay.
One Synod. Oh, okay. I think that last bit was from something else.
I was hoping that it wasn't ringing, it wasn't resonating with me, so I didn't know if it meant something more to you, Bob. But no, thank you so much. If we'll take a minute to close in prayer then. Dear God, you've laid a lot before us to think about today, and you know the prayers of this congregation for unity, for discernment, for peace, and also to show your deep and abiding love to us. We know what a toll this can take on the pastors, on the staff, on people who have been deeply hurt by some of the issues that are in this report. And so in your mercy, Lord, we hope you will hear our prayers and guide us to where we need to go. Amen.